first Edmonton HR in a box session. I'll try not to screw this up too much for the rest of our panelists this morning. I'm delighted to be here. As Elaine said in my bio, I'm a management consultant. I'm actually a recovering federal bureaucrat, so I'm just working through a few issues from that, but that was about 4 years ago. I used to work for Health Canada, and I worked there for 15 years as an executive director responsible for Western operations. As a management consultant, I focus my practice on strategy and organizational development, and along the way, people services has become a very large part of my practice. And so the various pieces that relate to helping organizations develop their organizational structures, their responses to different kinds of changes, mergers, breakups, and the other kinds of things that are common in our workplaces becomes very, very important. I'm also a father and a husband. I have 4 kids, so having an organizational structure that works for our family is very important, and we'll get into some of the postmodern ways that we're trying to organize things so that we can survive and keep up. So today I've been asked to talk a little bit about organizational structure, and the basic theme of my talk is a very high-level survey, but I'd like to encourage you to take any opportunity that you want to ask questions. It's going to be a participatory session. I'm not going to do all the talking, hopefully. Give you some things to think about, some different ways of organizing your own thought process when you're looking at organizational structures and how you might think about them maybe a bit differently than you've traditionally done so. If you think about the earliest moments in our civilization when people came together to complete tasks, they very quickly found that they couldn't do it all randomly acting as a group of actors inside the society, whether it was hunting or gathering or doing some kind of activity. And so the first nascent pieces of organizational structure began to emerge from the earliest days of human activity when people started participating together. So some examples of how they might divide roles and responsibilities might be in the completion of tasks such as hunting and coming back and bringing back the kill to the village, where they would then need to be able to organize the tasks, prepare that, and preserve the food. How many of you have participated in a major organizational change? Those of you that didn't raise your hand probably have, but maybe didn't recognize it quite as such. And when you've gone through that, what are some of the things that have driven that organizational change that has resulted in changing the structure? Anybody got a suggestion? Sorry? Business needs, yeah? Streamlining processes. Reducing headcount, maybe? Another cost pressure? Opportunities? New businesses? Changing the economic climate? Many of you are in the not-for-profit sector by the sounds of it. So how important is it to have organizational structures that are highly efficient? Resources are probably scarce, so you have to do things in alignment so that the work gets done as effectively as possible. So aligning things for efficiency, seeking new opportunities, improving decision-making. How many of you have worked in organizations that you would describe as bureaucratic? Some of you don't want to raise your hands. Don't worry about it. The filming, they can't see you. So a number of you have worked in large organizations. What happens in those complex organizations? How effective are they sometimes? So not everybody can see what people are doing, but some of you can do this. Not very effective.
Get bogged down in too many layers.
Bogged down in too many layers. And so that's really a function of where I want to start in talking about organizational structure. So what do we mean by organizational structure? Before I put the answer up on the board, what do some of you think of when you think of organizational structure? Management versus doing. Hierarchy. Yeah, okay. So authority, right? Who makes the decisions? Who decides budgets, decides what activities are going to be done? Communications, really important part of effective organization structure. In fact, I'm going to argue in a moment that communications is in fact what organizational structures are. They're a flowchart of effective communications. It's about rights. So who has the right to do certain things, i.e. make the decision. It's also about duties. So who has to do what to make sure an organizational structure at its most basic level is typically a hierarchical arrangement, as you just pointed out, of lines of authority, lines of communication, rights and duties of an organization. And it determines how the roles and the power and responsibilities are assigned within the organization. And, critically, how different levels of management and structure allow information to flow up, down, sideways, or into the ether, as it is with some organizations that we work with. So companies such as, if you imagine Procter & Gamble, that sells multiple products, so you can think of any large life sciences kind of company, is structured so that groups are divided according to each product, depending on their geographic area as well. And so when we get talking about different kinds of organizational structures, you'll see that they are a response to the business that they're in and the way that they have to distribute and flow that product or service that they're offering to other areas. So how do we show this? How do we demonstrate an organizational structure? Not a complicated answer. If you think it's obvious, you can show it out. An org chart. That's right. It's just like a genealogical chart, where you have a list of who begat who and how they're related to one another. In many sense, an organizational chart is that simple. It's about who is responsible for what tasks and activities within an organization, and who's responsible to others and how they relate to each other. So structure determines the roles, the power, and the responsibilities, how they're assigned, and critically, how they're controlled. And we're going to talk a little more about that distinction around control and how you exercise control in an organizational structure. And structure determines how information flows between different levels and units. So I said a moment ago, think of it as a communication flowchart. Now, why would I say think about it as a communication flowchart? I mean, are we talking about passing instructions from one to another? Why would it be akin to a communication flowchart? Yes. The most critical task of an effective organizational structure is to ensure the smooth flowing of information. It impacts all of your decision making. It impacts the understanding that you have of the roles and responsibilities within an organization. And it impacts the delegation and the exercise of authority. So what do you think happens if communication isn't clear? If people aren't clear about what their responsibilities and roles are vis-a-vis that structure? What starts to happen? Well, there becomes, I think, to the comment that was made a moment ago, there are too many actors. Communication gets bogged down, and what happens to the work that is required in the organization of the task that it's assigned to do? Is it as effective as it could be? It gets stuck. And so information flow is really important. And you can think of an effective organization structure as the grease behind the machine that allows it to operate effectively. And there's a number of components to that. And you can think about, and when you're talking about effective job descriptions and job alignment and the way that those pieces relate to each other. But in essence, the structure needs to support the effective communication of information from one level to another. So, in contrast, well-designed structures support efficient communication. The degree of autonomy and control has to be balanced against risk and nimbleness. So, effective structures are responsive and they encourage fast and clean decisions, where there isn't a huge amount of gap between those that are making the decisions and those that have to support the decisions. The effective structures can grant a high degree of local autonomy, but they can also ensure an excellent decision-making process where there is tight controls around things like budget decisions and whether different financial storms or other kinds of problems that they may run into. Now, how complex do you think that, say, a founder-run business is when it's started by somebody out of the back of their car? How many layers are there in that organization? Probably not a lot. And then you take a large organization, a complex enterprise, like say a government, like the government of Alberta. How many layers are in that structure? Or in the Department of Labor? Or in the health industry? Lots. And so the structures have to be aligned to the nature of the work that you're doing. So first and foremost, structures depend on what your organization's objectives and strategies are. Now, that's not just a nice comment. They have to be aligned to the vision, mission, and values of an organization. So if an organization values helping people, do you think that having a highly centralized bureaucracy that is removed from the people that you serve is a highly effective way of delivering the services? It might not be the best model. And so you might shun or move away from different kinds of organizational structures that are highly rigid, hierarchical, and centralized. So being aligned to the objectives of the organization and strategy is very important. We'll return to that in a few moments. When they are like this, when the organization's structure is aligned to the objectives and the strategy, they have more permanence. And there is less opportunity for that kind of churn change that happens in organizations that are trying to get aligned to their objectives and their values in an appropriate way. So just think for a moment, how many values affect structure? Anybody got a thought on that? For example, let's take an innovation organization, a research organization. What might be a value of that type of organization? Creativity. Yeah, what's another one? Risk-taking. Other examples? Ethics. Excellent. Innovation. Okay, so let's take those. Innovation, creativity, risk-taking, ethics. So now, if you were just thinking off the top of your head, what kind of organization, what would be important characteristics of an organization look like? To empower their staff? Yep. So perhaps some decentralized decision making? What else? Well, I didn't say a flat structure, but that's it. I know students want to do that. Yes, absolutely. So for example, nimbleness. Great. Any comment? Nimbleness, empowered decision making. So think about some innovation organizations that you know. Are they highly decentralized? Or do they have fairly rigid decision-making lines of authority? Does it matter that maybe they're publicly funded? So, for example, the values of the publicly funded organization often lend itself to more hierarchical forms of structure because they have an accountability to a taxpayer or to a public payer. Similarly, though, that can be in contrast to an organization's core values, which would be being responsible, being creative, being taking risks, empowering their researchers and their innovators to make decisions and to pursue their research. So you can see how very quickly it becomes a complex equation of trying to figure out what the right structure is that's going to align with the core values and mission of an organization. And aligning that then to the other kinds of competing interests that come into play. We'll talk a bit more about that. And the reason I wanted to highlight that is These are some of the types of organizations that all of you will work with, have worked with, where organizational structure conversations will come up throughout the course of your work as HR professionals. And they're different, right? They serve different audiences. They get their funding in different ways. Maybe your funding comes from a combination of public grants and volunteers and concerned citizens. Maybe your funding comes from charitable donations. In industry, maybe your stock, your shareholders have some issues with the companies running. That will drive the way that you think about organizational structure, executive compensation, and some of these sorts of things. And again, I put startup up here. If you're an innovator and you're in an innovative space and you're starting up and bootstrapping an organization, it can be really a very different discussion about organizational structure. And really the question there can be around timing. How do we build up and scale up as quickly as possible and as efficient a way as possible with limited resources? Here's some key characteristics of the organization. There's some up there. Is that a pretty good list? Size, geography, goods and services. So we'll talk about this in a minute. You can align yourself based on the kinds of products that you sell or the kinds of services that you offer. Key activities. Do you think that that's a little different depending on whether you're a public sector organization or a private sector organization? Not really. Doesn't have to be. Yeah. Sorry? Right? Yeah? That's a great comment. So, do you think it matters about the talent pool that is in a place like Silicon Valley? So companies are structured so that they have operations in Silicon Valley, in part because that's where the talent pool is. That's where the people are that they want to be there. And when jurisdictions think about economic development and retention strategies, there's a lot of talk about trying to create innovation hubs so that they can attract certain kinds of businesses, those startup businesses on the other side, so that they'll come and structure and scale and grow their businesses in a place like Edmonton. So absolutely, people matter, and where there is a concentration of people and skilled resources, you will see different kinds of organizational structures model to tap into those pools. It might also be true that there might be very specific expertise that exists in certain areas. I said a while ago that I work for the federal government, but I worked for the federal government in Western Canada my entire career. And there was certainly, I would say, pockets of expertise that were built up in certain regions of the country where they specifically would structure operations in order to create access to those talent pools. So that's great. So what are some of the different types of organizational structures? And I'm going to actually ask you to think now very basically. So I can see that many of you have the slides there, so you already know where I'm going. So I won't keep you in suspense here. The first one is pre-bureaucratic. So let's talk about that. What might be an example of a pre-bureaucratic structure? I'm not talking hunter-gatherer or in two kinds. And what's an example of a pre-bureaucratic structure? A small business, sure. Mom and pop shop, right? Yeah, you got some characteristics that go along with pre-bureaucratic structures. What might some of those characteristics be? So you said small business, that's the small part, right? There's just a few people involved. What else? Very few people, multiple roles. Everybody's a dishwasher, everybody's a cook. Yeah, you're right. Or a generalist. What else? Sorry?
too many layers, so there you don't have like middle management, upper management.
Yeah. There's not a lot of layers. That's an excellent comment. So in other words, there's highly centralized decision making. There's few people. And decision making and authority is largely not standardized because it's individually focused. So have you heard some of your friends and colleagues and family maybe that are involved in entrepreneurial or small businesses say like, well, I just know what I need to do. So they don't have a high degree of standardization. They have instincts. Decision making is informal, but it is highly nimble in that regard because they can make decisions quickly. It's typical of startups or single service businesses. Family-owned enterprises often operate this way. Decisions are made around the kitchen table. You may have heard that expression before. That replaces the boardroom table. And as you mentioned, a lot of generalists that do everything. And many of you in the voluntary sector probably appreciate that you may have all jobs that are ascribed to you, but you do other people require, I suspect, in your So that's a pre-bureaucratic structure. So, now let's think about bureaucratic structure. And I'm not saying these are all negative. There's a very good reason why structures become bureaucratic. So what would be the characteristics of bureaucratic structure? Sorry? Very hierarchical. Got to guess why they're hierarchical? Got to guess why they're hierarchical? Yeah, a lot of layers, a lot of processes. It's a response to risk and perceived risk. It's also a response to complexity. So the business, unlike the example we just talked about, is multiple service lines, multiple program activities, multiple, perhaps if we were talking about private sector content, multiple product lines. So as businesses grow, as organizations grow, they become more complex and they get exposed to greater risks and more risks. And the degree that those risks can actually fundamentally affect you and that you can build resilience is a function, to a certain extent, of your organizational structure and how flexible it is and how responsive it is to what you perceive those challenges are that you're trying to address. So there's, unlike bureaucratic structures, there's some characteristics of bureaucratic structures. There's strict adherence to standardization, lots of policies, standard operating procedures. They are typically very hierarchical. They're command and control, top-down management structures. I like the machine metaphor. If you think about the Second World War and a lot of the organizations that emerged out of that, they were highly bureaucratic. They were structured, and I'll use the government example, they were structured by departments, which were structured into branches or into divisions that could be aligned, and there were layers after layers after layers put in place in order to control and affect in an efficient manner the flow of information and communication within these organizations. It also becomes a structure that is very good at tracking accountability for budgets, for people, for resources. So bureaucratic structures have all these levels, and it's easy to get frustrated by that. I'm looking at the bureaucracy. I know I say it all the time. I started off by saying that I'm a recovering bureaucrat. They can be very frustrating for people working within them because you have by definition a limited span of control. It's by design that you have a limited span of control within a bureaucratic structure. It can take forever to get things done, particularly if you're in a geographic division and aligned by a particular service line. And how many of you can say that your greatest frustration is getting information up through the many layers of accountability that you have? I mean, how many of you have experienced that? It doesn't have to be in the present context. But, yeah, a few hands. Some of you didn't put your hands up. So, Organization charts exist for every department. There are clear standardization of policies and programs in place. So people, to the greatest extent possible, they try to take out any element of uncertainty from that system, because that's one of the things that they're trying to respond to in the bureaucratic typology of organizational structures. Top-level managers have tremendous control in these environments. There's a reason why they call deputy ministers mandarins. It relates back to the Japanese term where they are in charge of the entire range of things under their purview. The expression is not an accident. And in these kinds of organizations, they're very, very centralized decision-making. Do bureaucracies encourage or discourage innovation and creativity? It's a thought attribute that somebody may put on the table earlier. What do you think? Typically, they struggle with creativity and innovation because, in fact, it's a function of their organizational structure to discourage those things and to constrain decision. And it's no surprise to those of you that have worked in the public sector or work in the public sector that internally there's a huge debate about how they encourage innovation within those contexts when their structure is often designed specifically to depress it. So let's talk about post-bureaucratic structures. So what make those? Post-bureaucratic sounds kind of like science fiction. If we're all going to use Google Glass and remote into our workforce. Just out of curiosity, how many of you work remotely or have worked from multiple locations? Surprising. How many of you manage or put in place HR policies to support people that work remotely? Okay, so a few more than you. This is not something that you haven't experienced. And certainly organizations are changing more and more, allowing for the depth of geography, as the expression goes, and trying to put in place programs and stuff. Many of the organizations that are now some of the largest in the world have kind of moved into post-bureaucratic structures. I mean, one need only think of Google. I'll return to Google in a moment. Google is an example of a post-bureaucratic structure in some important ways. They don't have work units larger than 7 people, which is interesting, and that they tend to work based on a combination of different reasons by teams. And so their HR management policies are actually quite interesting to study about how they manage that workflow. So post-bureaucratic structures are really characterized by matrix models, team-based or project-based approaches to organizing the business. And they include companies like Google, Fiverr, certain professional services firms are moving in that way. Associations are moving in that way that have diverse stakeholder interests. Hierarchies still exist, so they haven't abandoned the tenets of bureaucracy. And the organization is still rule-bound, because that's the only way that they can actually function. But they are, in important ways, pressing the boundaries of what's possible in terms of doing that. And some of those models have been successful. Some of them, the jury's still out on how well they work and how well. But one of the things that's clear is that the issue of control, who makes the decisions, is still paramount in these organizations. There still has to be a decision maker, and there still has to be an understood process for communicating critical information through the organization. And technology doesn't always get that easy. That's something I appreciate about anybody that gets more than a dozen emails or text. So, given that typology of pre-bureaucratic, bureaucratic, and post-bureaucratic, what are some of the different types of organizational structures that we might have? So, these are not mutually exclusive. I should have had a Venn diagram up there to show you, but instead I have a list. So, hierarchical is obviously one. We'll talk about functional in a moment. Divisional, sometimes called the product model, and matrix models. And these are all the examples of basically bureaucratic or post-bureaucratic structures as we go forward. So keep that typology in mind. So if we understand organizational structure to refer to how people in an organization are grouped and to whom they report and how communication flows, then the organizational structure will define how the organization performs or operates and communicates. So in a hierarchical, the most simplest of forms, this is an organizational structure that connotes a top-down relationship. There is a boss. There are people that either mediate different kinds of things in the middle, pick your title, and then there are various alignments of employees that would function underneath it. It is simple. It clearly delineates who has what authority and the flow of information. And it tends to be very command and control. And so the further one goes up the hierarchy, the more decision-making authority they have. Some would argue the more responsibility they have. And they own the decisions. Which is why there's a very proud tradition of CEOs and deputies and executive directors falling on their sword when there is a fatal flaw that occurred in the organization. And that comes from an old idea that while authority may flow top-down, responsibility flows up. And so you can cue up your little joke here about the other stuff that goes downhill and uphill. But in typically hierarchical organizations, the notion is that accountability flows down and responsibility flows up. So what about functional organizations? A very common way, in fact the most common way of organizing people is by function. So these are common functions in an organization. Human resources is a function in an organization. Marketing could be one. The production of a particular good could be another way of organizing things. So what are some of the characteristics that make functional organizations really beneficial? Any suggestions? What over here? It's more specialized? Yeah. It allows for more specialization, for sure. Yeah. So you can become really good at making something. Or doing something. Yeah. How effective is communication in the functional model? How good is it within the functional unit? Very good. And people start to speak common language, and they can be quite innovative. But you're quite right. When you extrapolate that across an organization, what tends to be the knock against functional organizations is that they end up having, how many of you have heard the expression silos? Functional organizations are prone to silo-like thinking. So I'm in my department, I work in my department, I work with people that are aligned with me or specialized like me, and they don't tend to necessarily communicate easily or as effectively or smoothly across some of those functional boundaries. Communication and in organizations with functional design can be rigid because of the standardized ways of operating with a high degree of formalization. So they become very formal. And so you can have functional examples where you can grow inside your job stream, but you don't necessarily get the opportunity to grow outside of that job stream. So the divisional structure or product structure contains self-contained divisions. So a division, as differentiated from a function, contains a collection of functions that might be involved in one area. And it's usually aligned around a profit center or a program activity that has many different functions. And so these divisional structures, they're quite common in government. They will plan together, they will develop a strategy together, and they will sometimes guide at the profit center or a core activity of a larger organizational unit. It's the second most common structure across North America that you see. And employees who are responsible for certain markets or services or types of products are placed in divisional structure. So, you know, you can talk about, say, Hyundai cars. Well, they have an American division. They also have a truck division, and they have an SUV division. And so divisional structures are ways of organizing, but based on some of those key characteristics we talked about. And they're better at doing delegated authority through their divisional structures. So what do you think is good about divisional structures? Any suggestions? Why do they work? Efficiency, across so that each unit is measured within that unit, and so they're responsible for the outcomes that they seek to do, and because they plan as a division, they can achieve this. So, can you think of a modern company that has taken that kind of divisional structure to a new level? Apple. They have an iPod. They have an iPad team, and they move across those divisions. Like functional organizations, they can also become siloed, and they can actually become competitive with one another. And that's one of the things Steve Jobs was railing against when he came back to that, because he said, we're not talking to the right people across our divisional structures. So you can have very strong leadership within a division. It can lead to high employee morale. People can get excited about what they're doing. It's local enough, or it's contained enough, that people can wrap their heads around what it is that they're trying to accomplish. But the knock against it is that there can be more of an emphasis on divisional goals rather than organizational goals. And so, I do some work with professional associations, and you can see that within the professional associations. There's silos, again, start to crop up based on the different kinds of functions that are put within different divisions, and really trying to elevate the conversation, even in not very large organizations, but there are organization-wide discussions. So the final one up there, matrix organizations. I kind of look at matrix organizations as trying to have their cake and eat it too. So matrix organizations are, what would be your top of mind guess of what a matrix organization is? Yeah, it's a hybrid. So I report to a divisional chief who is responsible for Alberta, but maybe I also report to somebody who manages management consulting services within my organization, and I might also report to somebody who manages HR services. That's a matrix organization. So what do you think works good about that? How does that work? What's good about a matrix organization? Yeah, there's more communication, there's more interaction between departments. It's reflective of the actual flow of communication, the people that you need to talk to, right, to make decisions. So I'm going to ask another question. Just because we can draw them in the org chart, does that make it easier? So I just said a second ago that it's reflective of the flow of communication. Is that actually how communication works? You have to help you communicate as full stop. For matrix structures to work, they introduce an element of complexity, immense complexity into organizational structures. They are a response, a different kind of response to the traditional, very hierarchical organization to say, we actually have many different ways of thinking about our business. We can think about services, we can think about geographies, we can think about our size, we can think about all the different ways that we might want to align our business, and we want to do it all. And so what happens is you tend to diffuse accountability in those organizations. Because where there isn't one decision maker and there's a team of decision makers, you end up, at least it would be the the clear example might be government organizations that have gone in and tried matrix organizations, is that when things go wrong, there isn't anybody clearly to point to and say, that's the solution. Now, some organizations have said, we're not ready to abandon matrix models because they have a lot to give them credit for it. And so what they have actually tried to do is set up shared decision-making tables. Sometimes they're called tables or forums, and they'll say, you know, division unit chief, geographical lead, and functional lead, you three control one budget, and you will decide how to do that. So matrix organizations can work, but they also are very complex and difficult to manage. And as HR professionals, if you're implementing a matrix organization in an organization that you're working with, you have to make sure that those communication flows are clear and those accountabilities are clear in the way that those are going to flow. The vertical structure of functional organizations mixed with the more lateral or horizontal. I had a boss once who used to call it pipelines between the silos. Was the reason we were going for a matrix organization. It can work. They can address that silo critique, but you have to have a lot of processes in place in order to make it run efficiently. So I just want to spend a moment talking about team networks and virtual. So these are some examples of emerging post-bureaucratic organizations. I mentioned earlier the example of Google. These are highly autonomous teams that are given very specific tasks. They involve people with a variety of functional skill sets that are brought together. Typical management structure in these ones put a lot of support in the project manager so that the terms of reference or the team charter becomes the defining document that articulates the accountabilities. These are still hierarchical structures because you need somebody overseeing all the teams and working, but they are more autonomous and they move and they form and they unform. And it's only been in the last, I'll say a couple decades anyway, that you've really seen this elevated to the level of more organizational structure. I mean, I was reflecting on the fact that Google's less than 15 years old the other day. And it shocked me that a company like that, which has completely turned its organizational structure thinking on its head, is that new. But they largely use a team structure. There's also elements of network involved in there. Sorry, before I leave team structure, I just want to mention that there are some other examples I used that are leading edge of that. Xerox is actually a good one, and as they try to reimagine some of their business, Motorola, which maybe wasn't as successful at reimagining their business, tried a team management structure, and Daimler Chrysler, which I don't think it's even called that anymore. So again, team structures there's a number of organizations that are experimenting with them. They give them more flexibility, but they are also, in some respects, kind of like playing with fire. They're harder to control, they're harder to manage, and they're typically used by companies that are trying to innovate in a big hurry. Networks. So why might people consider using networks? To share information? Yep. Because they're maybe too closey. Getting closely. Networks also reflect the way that we communicate increasingly in a multi-channel world, and they create nodes and opportunities to do that. And an example of that is the clothing retailer H&M, which has a completely networked, their supply chain is completely outside of their company, outside of their control. And so their network and their management structure is completely set up on a global network supply chain. And then the final one is virtual organizations. I think we can all imagine that. Amazon was an early adopter of this structure. They existed in cyberspace, they existed on the web. And this is part of a whole body of literature that's emerging around the boundary of this organization. And so how they will end up settling in terms of organizational structure theory is still to be seen. But those organizations are propping up daily in terms of the way that they operate. So my final slide is this one. And I want to just put it up here to give you some sense of how these pieces fit together. And I believe my colleagues will probably talk a little bit about some of these elements. But organizational structure fits within a broader range, as all of you know as HR professionals, within the world of human resource or people management, and it relates to the way that we describe the roles and responsibilities of individuals. It's the way that they relate to each other internally and the way they relate to a marketplace that is competing for those goods and services. Then if you think about that, you think about the way that you reward and compensate people for their work. So that's that whole first bubble there. And the way that you think about the kinds of competencies that you might want to ascribe to the individuals brought in. We talked a lot about you need effective communicators for matrix organizations to be effective. So if you're choosing an organizational structure that values that kind of structure, then it's important that you have a clear in your mind the kinds of competencies that it will take for people to be successful. And then in the final analysis, when you come to say, okay, is our organization being as effective as it could be, is it performing as it should be, you have some metrics and ways of going back and looking at it and say, yeah, we're aligned in those areas. So that's just a little diagram to help you understand that there's a relationship between each of these areas. Unless there's any further questions. Thank you very much.